opportunity to teach students. So I'm currently living in Los Angeles, but much of this work took place in the Mixedwood Plains ecozone of southwestern Ontario. So I'm going to talk about three separate things today. The first, part one, is called Urban Bestiary, which will explore research and methods for attempting to understand the spatial, biological, and perceptual worlds of animals. Part two is called Synanthropic Suburbia, which imagines prosthetics to suburban single-family homes that invite non-humans to dwell alongside of us. And then part three, I'm calling Human Non-Human, and then reflects on this work and asks four critical questions about designing beyond us. In response, I'll share student work from electives taught at the University of Waterloo and the University at Buffalo. So before we can take on more than human-centered approach to design, we need to understand who we are designing for. I think a lot of the practitioners this weekend have sort of inhabited different bodies through their work. And so as part of my research for my Master's of Architecture thesis, I created an urban bestiary, which delves into the understanding the cultural position and biological perspectives of a collective of animals. It is structured after a bestiary, which is really a medieval illuminated text, which aggregated all knowledge at a particular time, be it scientific, religious, cultural, mythological, surrounding a selected species to create somewhat of a holistic portrait of the animal as it was known at that time, or at least as it was imagined, as many of them didn't actually exist. So I was specifically interested in synanthropes, which are animals that benefit from living in close proximity to humans, yet remain beyond our control. These non-human citizens are most abundant in cities, where they have really learned to adapt to the anthropogenic environments that we have created, and where they benefit often from the novel habitat opportunities and year-round food abundance that we create. So the urban bestiary in particular examines 5 synanthropic animals common to southwestern Ontario, but to many places in the world. The brown rat, the house sparrow, the feral pigeon, the peregrine falcon, and then the common raccoon. So I'm gonna today just share mostly about the brown rat. So I did sort of many media forms for trying to understand each of these species. So one thing I did was to look at the 800-year history of our human relationships with rats and organize them across a scale from, at the top, beneficial encounters that I came across to dangerous. And I will say this is from very much from a human perspective approach. I then also wanted to understand how rats inhabited the urban environments that we create. And so I borrowed from the language of architectural graphic standards, which prescribes sizes of space for humans. And so I tried to recreate the same thing for rats, trying to understand how deep can they burrow, how do they create nests, how high can they climb, because they sure can climb and they can also swim. So I then also tried to create biological parameter drawings, as I called them, that really tried to capture the characteristics of the animals, fur, whiskers, claws, all of these kind of parts of animals that often get abstracted, I think, in architectural representation, if they ever kind of make it into images. And then also to think about the biological relationships that they have, both with us and with other species that live in the urban environment. I then kind of dove into sensory perception. So a rat, for example, has poor vision and high sensitivity to touch and light. And they only see the world in dichromatic color. So really in a kind of binary 2 colors that are in the like blue range. And so as a result, they often rely on touch to navigate the environment. So when I was doing this research, I came across a concept by Jakob von Uexküll called the Umwelt, which I'm probably saying it incorrectly, but in German I think just translates to environment. But his idea was that every organism embodies a subjective perceptual world that's unique to them. And so he tried to kind of illustrate this concept through diagrams and imagery. And so on the left illustrates how a human being might perceive a field of flowers. The form of the proximate flowers might be more distinct. The field in the distance is sort of at a lower resolution, and then the forest in the background has a shape but not a unique specificity of elements, versus the bee, which is then placed at the center of the image, doesn't necessarily perceive itself in the same way as the human viewing it in the meadow, and for it has these different signifiers. So an open flower that is ready for pollination is a different signifier, so they're shown as stars versus a closed flower, which is not yet ready, is shown as a circle. And then the distant field and forest are sort of outside its perceptual range. And so I use this concept to say that how would a rat perceive the urban environment that we share? And so I rendered the sort of imaginary urban section through a city in dichromatic colors and tried to think about what are the edges and spaces that a rat might use to navigate those spatial environment, and then what are important signifiers for it. So like trash, for example, that people drop along a subway, or food that is stored in a lower basement cellar level. I then used the same technique to say, well, what is a feral pigeon's perception of that same space? And since pigeons see in pentachromatic color and can also see ultraviolet light, they have a completely different sort of reading of the city. They're also interested in sort of different heat sources and ledges and cables for nesting and perching. And then this last one imagines a peregrine falcon, which is I would say, more recently adapted urban species. And for them, the city is a space of elevated tower perches and mechanically heated nesting sites. The crevices and canyons created by the urban fabric are then also abundant with pigeons and rats on which to feed. So the urban bestiary for me provided an understanding of synanthropic animals and their relationship to humans, which served then as a foundation for the following design experiments. So synanthropic suburbia was the sort of large body of work, and as you can see, Joyce was actually my external reader. So, so we as humans have complex relationships with and perceptions of our more than human neighbors that are often structured by our physical environments. So when an animal is outside the boundaries of our domestic realm, such as the image on the left, we consider it wild, potentially a neighbor, something to be observed. That same animal, when entering into the space of our home, becomes an intruder. Within that space, if we then captivate or control it, it then becomes a pet. But what happens to these species who live at the periphery of our homes, nesting in the eaves and living in the attic and even inhabiting our walls? How can architecture negotiate the physical boundary between the human and the non-human? So I took the position that the tension between humans and non-humans is sometimes greatest felt at the boundary of the home, and potentially even more so in the suburbs, where the sentiment of autonomy and control of one's environment might be felt most strongly. This is the marketing material for what they call Greystone 3, which was a model home by a company called Star Lane in Ontario. What I found compelling is that it shows this sort of freestanding house in this like pastoral landscape with really mature trees surrounding it, when in fact this is the current reality, at least throughout Ontario, is each of the Greystone 3, this is the exact model, was built cheek and jowl with its neighboring clones, and that these same home models have been replicated across acres, rapidly transforming what typically is agricultural fields into a landscape of concrete roadways, fresh sod, and very young saplings. So synanthropic suburbia tries to leverage the substantial disturbance and standardization of suburban development to imagine a series of prosthetics to these existing single-family houses that could restructure human-non-human interactions and enhance biodiversity within a suburban ecosystem. So you can see the suggestions of 3 things. There's to the left a compost chimney, above the garage what's called an extended eave, and then the top is a habitat dormer, and I'll go into each of those. So underlying all of these explorations is a hypothesis that small architectural elements, such as a chimney, if multiplied, could possibly have a wide-scale territorial impact. If we start from the small scale of the more than human, what might we discover as designers? So I wanted to then say, who are these subjects that I'm going to engage in this design practice with? And so this graph maps a kind of inversely proportional relationship between a species' ability to adapt to the urban environment and our human tolerance of cohabitation with that species. So the rat at the topmost corner, we have the least tolerance often for proximate cohabitation, and versus a barn owl at the far side we might most welcome. So I then selected 3 pairs of species, each with different proportions of adaptability and tolerance to serve as primary subjects for the design. So the first one was the chimney swift, which is an at-risk bird species with sporadic flying patterns that it earned its name for its ability to, in the past, and preference for nesting in chimneys. However, people don't really use fireplaces in the same way anymore for other beneficial reasons, but as a result, there's not as much habitat for these species. The raccoon, on the other hand, are already synanthropes. They're already inevitable neighbors in many Canadian cities. And this medium-sized nocturnal creature is often really notorious for knocking over the green bin composting system in the city of Toronto, such that they spent like millions of dollars trying to design a raccoon-proof compost bin. So the nightly disturbances and unsightly mess that raccoons often leave behind are really considered a nuisance for most homeowners. And so the compost chimney prosthetic seeks to productively employ both the raccoon and the homeowner in the conversion of organic waste into nutrient-rich soil. So homeowners from the interior place food waste into the lower composting chamber, which is then aerated when the raccoon turns an external gear, you can kind of see on the far side, that helps rotate the compost, and as a result, they get some amount of food. It's a form of wage tube that they're engaged in. The upper volume of the compost chimney ventilates the compost and provides much needed warmth, warmed nesting sites for the chimney swift themselves. Outside the immediate space of the house, the compost chimney has the capacity to enrich the local ecosystem. What if the composted soil from the chimney served to enrich the sort of local soil, and instead of, like suburbs, especially in Ontario, are often controlled by something called architectural control guidelines that specify both how the homes themselves are clad, but often how the landscape around or the site around the house is managed. And so to subvert these standards, the idea of a corridor setback requirement is implemented, which creates a shared zone between properties. Instead of building a fence between properties, residents could concentrate in the composted soil and planting along this corridor to still give themselves privacy, but ultimately, over time, the rear yard could become a kind of abundant area of vegetation that creates a habitat corridor across residential blocks and easily allows animals, be they raccoons, deers, birds, to move more freely between the space of the homes. The second prosthetic is the extended eave. It merges eaves troughs and gutters to exhaust vents. Merges eaves troughs and gutters with exhaust vents to create extended season habitat for bluebirds and tree swallows. Both of these are at-risk birds due to competition by abundant house sparrows and already adapted synanthrope, who often like to nest in the same cavity types. So the extended eave provides a nesting box within the drainage and exhaust system of a house, often these sort of peripheral architectural elements that are rarely considered. And the expanded trough itself collects and slowly releases the water, giving these water-loving birds a chance to bathe while also supporting aquatic plants and reducing pressures on the stormwater system in these suburban areas. The extended eave enhances the aesthetic and ecological value of the house while encouraging desirable avian species to serve as natural pest control. But the same idea could then be extended to potentially different birds. So a goldfinch, which actually likes to nest in a branching structure, you might say there's a different prosthetic for that species, and how could that then encourage people to think about their landscape differently? Instead of a lawn that's cut at a consistent rate, could people let their lawn go to seed and turn into a bit more of a wildflower landscape? This idea also could be translated to a bobolink, which is a ground nesting bird, and instead say, like, could you use that storage capacity system of the extended eave to sort of try and irrigate an abundant grassland for them? And then the last one is the habitat dormer, which provides nesting sites for 2 nocturnal species, the barn owl and the brown bat, both of which are at risk and suffering from habitat loss due to changes really in architectural and agricultural practices. So barn owls, as you can tell from their name, once shared a kind of mutually beneficial relationship with farmers, finding shelter in barns in exchange for essentially helping to control rodents. But with the use of chemical rodenticide, that sort of practice fell out of favor. And then brown bats, which are hungry consumers of insects, typically find shelter similarly in drafty barns or attics, often beneath cladding material. However, as building enclosures become increasingly tight with things like passive house and better performance, which have benefits from an energy use perspective, there's less opportunities for brown bats. So within a suburban context, each distinct species is capable of providing pest control services. The habitat dormer adds a room at the attic level of the house, creating new real estate for the family, but also opportunities for these species to live alongside. I made a portion of bat wall and attached it to my brother's suburban house. Stayed up for a while until he decided to sell it, and it wasn't really a marketable feature at the time. So the idea with these is to say, how can these small apparatus that get attached to the house be deployed across the neighborhood? And could these synurban strategies, I started to call them, have the potential to change a local ecology? So then zooming out to the territorial scale, this is often the fabric of suburban landscapes outside of Toronto. So this is in the Greater Toronto Area, specifically in Markham. But as you can see, there are these the movement vector corridors that we as humans have often disrupt the movement vectors of non-human species. So a lot of these areas have existing riverways, but then the freeways and the roadways just kind of cut right across them. And then there's similarly the kind of construction sometimes of parks. So there's these creations of maybe more intensive green areas, but they're extremely kind of isolated. A lot of golf courses as well, unfortunately. So the first idea is to say, how could we define a synurban zone? So to address the issues of discontinuity and lack of habitat are really therefore critical to kind of supporting some sort of ecosystem beyond, having certain things immediately around your house, and improving the ecological quality of the suburban biome. So the first strategy is to create a boundary offset from the existing system of waterways and vegetation. The compost chimneys would then be installed on all houses within this synurban zone to improve soil quality, and homeowners would then be encouraged to become students of their own backyard and contribute to the fortification of the existing ecological system. The next idea would be to create transverse connections, corridors between the existing north-south system that increase the overall circuity of the network, allowing animals to better circumnavigate the perils of the road network. And then the last is to further enrich the ecosystem. Homeowners could create habitat-specific patches by implementing the extended eave. Instead of naming suburban neighborhoods for the landscapes they created or that they once replaced, suburban neighborhoods could be named for the future ecosystems they want to cultivate. So Goldfinch Heights, Robin Acres, for example. All right, and then this last section, human, non-human, part 3 brings together student work from teaching that was done at 2 different universities and in 2 different, very, very different contexts. But they both kind of continued this non-human design thinking developed through synanthropic suburbia. So bear with me, I'm going to talk 2 things at once. So side A, Architecture Across the Ecological Continuum, was a graduate seminar taught at Waterloo. It was taught virtually. We spent a lot of time collaborating in Miro, but we actually used this space of the School of Architecture as our kind of shared focal point for early research throughout the semester. So we were looking at the School of Architecture, which is just really a single building. We don't even have a campus. That was an old silk mill turned through various iterations into the School of Architecture and has been around for 100 years. It's an old masonry timber building. So then the other side is called New Normals, which design exercises for an aging population, which was taught at the University of Buffalo. That title is wrong at the bottom. And took place in person in the space of the school and with an exhibition in the space of the school. Again, there's choice. But they're both have very different subjects. So the one continued sort of focus on the more than human, and the other looked at a population that I would argue is often overlooked in architecture and design, which is our senior citizens, our young old, as Dean Simpson likes to call them. And so all of this work was centered around kind of 4 questions, and the first was, how can designers multiply the perspectives through which we design? It is a challenge to designers to critically examine the perspective through which we individually design, both our own personal perspectives, but also the dominant cultural assumptions that we are sort of brought up in, educated in, and exposed to over time. So from the architecture across the equilibrium class, we did this in-class exercise where essentially we said, what are the species that are in the immediate proximity around the School of Architecture, which is along a river? And so through in class, they essentially tried to, as groups, research the perceptual world, the spatial parameters of these species, and then create these Umwelt drawings, which it was incredible to be like, okay, turn off your cameras for 20 minutes and come back, and just to see the sort of transformation that happened for some of these students. We did the same kind of exercise for older adults, particularly thinking about older adults who are experiencing a medical condition that changes their embodied experience of the world. So the one on the right, she was looking at Alzheimer's and how that changes how you move through space. So it changes your depth perception, creates a lot of contrast between light and dark spaces as you move from inside to outside, and things like textured patterns on the floor might actually appear as like moving insects, for example. And the one on the left, which a student who had never like done Photoshop or anything did this, I think, in Microsoft Paint, which I just find incredible. She was an undergrad student, but she was trying to convey the loss of proprioception, which is like your awareness about where your body is in space relative to itself and to the things around it. And so she likened that to being underwater and what that does to your understanding of where you are in space. So the second question is, how can designers disrupt standards which underlie normative space? And the goal with this was to bring attention to spatial discriminations embedded within the system of architectural production. So these students, for the final project of this seminar, students had to come up with a speculative fabulation, some kind of imagined project where they were really operating as moles within the architectural profession to say, like, what do we need to change to bring about a kind of new practice? And so Pratik and Nupur redlined essentially building codes and like condominium regulations in Toronto to say, like, how can we bring new urban and ecological action to the city and development in that way. And then as a class at Buffalo, students who were doing this research on aging conditions redlined Neufert architects data, which is similar to architecture graphic standards, came up in Nazi era Germany and was an idea about standardizing architecture and space. So how do you take something that to this day is still repeated and used widely and say this is super problematic, and to use the redlining tools that we use in the building of any project to do that. And then the third one is, how can designers practice empathically when designing for others? I think the word empathy has come up quite a few times. And so Tulsi did this really lovely guide through the covered rivers of Toronto, where she took us on a tour via Zoom, our Zoom class, on both what the rivers are now since they've been covered, but imagining the possible world in which they are uncovered and exposed, and that connection to an ecosystem is built with the people who live in Toronto. In the Buffalo class, thinking about older adults, we actually said, unlike with non-human species who we really can't speak with in the same kind of conventional way, we could speak with senior citizens in the city of Buffalo. And so we did a series of these exercises where we asked people, like, what is your daily routine? What is the environment of your daily routine? But also, what are the support systems that you have in place that keep you going? And the students also did and shared this, so it was really interesting to see kind of a lot of the overlaps between this. And then finally, the last one is, how can designers translate these embodiments, these new understandings, into inclusive environments? So the first, this group of 4 students collectively wrote a graphic novel about biorock, and this is just some of the panels, and I'll quickly go through it. But essentially, a protest erupts in Metro City. The COVID pandemic has made people acutely aware of how cramped their living conditions are, and they want to demand a new ecological future. For some reason, the high-level response is the engineering of something called biorock, which is, they called it a living, non-sentient, self-replicating material. And so the students then speculated on how this material would be seeded, gradually growing and metabolizing inorganic materials like concrete and plastic, and eventually creating a multi-species habitat. You can't see it, but the bottom left, there's like an advertisement for a raccoon condo coming. And then in the middle, they actually imagine that in fact concrete and plastic no longer exist. And in order to record that history, they create a museum of concrete and plastic to say, these things are no longer present in our world, but what do they look like, so we can all remember. And then the last, the student wrote the kind of, this sort of surreal conclusion in which, in fact, despite this sort of utopian multi-species world, in fact, due to bats' association with COVID, they had always been excluded from Metro City and this new bio-rock world. And ultimately, there was one sort of mutation to bio-rock that they tried to do, which made it so that bats' echolocation wouldn't reflect off of the bio-rock structure, and ultimately that led to it crumbling. And so there was this sort of like dystopian end in which bio-rock city just fell apart, which I thought was a fascinating tour the students took us on. And then this from the other class, the students developed an adaptive environment prototype for older adults, where they really took the research that their classmates had done in that semester and the semester before to develop some kind of prototype. And so Emma and Lauren created, they called it Securbience, but essentially it was like a kind of granny cart that you could take anywhere with you for somebody who has early onset Alzheimer's or dementia, that sometimes there's an overstimulus in the environment that can cause disorientation. So their idea was that you could deploy this temporary enclosure to give yourself isolation in the urban environment should you want it. So for 4 prompts: disrupt standards, multiply perspectives, practice empathically, and translate these embodiments into new designs. There's some things I have read that have helped shape a lot of this thinking, and that's the QR code. Oh, I think I gotta give you this, right?
Hi, thank you for that great presentation, Sarah. And now we're going to welcome Megan back up to the stage and start entering your questions using the QR code. We have a couple questions already, so we'll start with, so both Megan and Sarah, both of you have a unique perspective looking at your respective research through a feminist lens. Can you elaborate on, either one of you going first, elaborate on the intersectionality of many species design and how designing beyond us can start dismantling the privilege and power structures that use science to design as tools of oppression?
So I think for me, especially the 4 prompts that really came out through looking again at humans. I had this sort of circuitous path of like looking at the non-human and the more than human to say, in fact, there's so much about the sort of human experience that are deprioritized in design, and instead what is often taught in school is things like le modulor, which is Corbusier's figure of essentially a cis able-bodied white man, and that stands as the basis for prescribing space. Sorry, that's not Corbusier. Well, there's also Corbusier, and then also Neufert has the same kind of thing. And so I actually, for me, what was fascinating was like looking outside of ourselves as human species to then come back to a more complex and nuanced perspective through which to approach designing for both ourselves and more than ourselves. So yeah, that was kind of the round.
Thank you. I heard the word intersection in there, and that's the key point that I'm taking away and remembering.
Yes.
I feel like I just lately, I'm kind of at a point in my PhD where I need to be kind of defining what I'm doing a little bit more clearly than being so all over the place, which I have really enjoyed luxuriating in. And so part of that has been thinking about how I'm working within feminist science studies and if feminist is the right word, and wondering what feminism means to me right now. And a lot of the entry points into the environmental humanities thinking that I'm doing came from people who are doing feminist science studies work in a particular way with particular kinds of interests in gender. And intersection comes in here because I feel like feminism then becomes kind of like this original site for thinking about difference, that for me is important in terms of gender, but also in terms of like heteronormative structures, in terms of species. And so I think at the beginning of my talk I said something about attending to and making space for the pluralities in any assumed we. And for me, that's the really critical point. Anytime I see a we, that becomes like that feminist kind of line of inquiry becomes the starting point for me to start unpacking that. And yeah.
Great, thank you. That's a great answer. Another question for you, and this is again for both of you, but starting with Sarah. So, synthetic steroidea takes a close look at animals that are commonly regarded as pests or nuisances. But similarly, Megan talks about oysters and how oysters are rarely even acknowledged as having brain activity or being alive, and kind of the scientific bias. And so, do you have any ideas on designing for oysters and apply your work to maybe more waterfront habitats, or what kind of thoughts do you have maybe on Megan's work and kind of the correlation between pests and animals we don't give the right thought to?
Can I also add to that question?
Yes, please.
Yeah, while you were presenting and giving these kind of sort of like speculative designs of how these different creatures are perceiving, I was really curious if you have ever tried to do that work with something with like such a radically different sensory capacity as an oyster, or like what's the most extreme?
I have not. I do think Jakob von Uexküll has a drawing of a starfish, which I think is similar in that it doesn't have the same like sort of visual frame of reference. I will say first, Kate Orff is the woman to talk to when it comes to oysters. But I think what's interesting and what I kind of wanted to play with in the work was this like question of pest and how much our human perception is tied to pest and defining an animal or a more than human in that way. And I think what's interesting in the oyster, and I think you've sort of touched on it, is that like it so often is like sort of barely even given subjectivity. I've even heard that some people who are, a friend of mine went to a vegan restaurant and was served an oyster as a kind of provocation, like, is this even considered a kind of living thing to that point? And so I think while not a pest, there is, I feel like it's almost maybe given more akin to like a plant in the way that it's sort of grown and nurtured and given this kind of environment that it's encouraged to be brought up within. And so if I was to design for that, I think there's also this question of like, how do you make the space of nurture for the farmer? Like, was that you with the yellow boots stuck in the mud? Yeah. Like that seems like a sort of challenging experience and part of it. So not to make that easier, but to say like, how do you place these two beings in proximity in a way that works harmoniously in some kind of way? It would be an interesting process to go through, and to also sort of map the Umwelt both of the farmer as they create and cultivate, but also of the oyster as they live in that kind of ecosystem. So that's not an answer, that's a circuitous thought.
Further provocation. Maybe a studio here. We have another question. So, architectural environmental studies or design and writing are synthetic practices in which navigating bodies of knowledge from many disciplines is the center of the work. Could you talk about this in terms of engaging knowledge from other disciplines, sciences, in your work? And I think you can talk about Sarah and then Megan, coming from environmental studies background, maybe how you engage other sciences in your work as well.
Did you say? Okay. Yeah, I mean, I guess as I kind of mentioned before, I've been in this place of in-betweenness forever. as my undergraduate studies, I was in a sort of design and arts program called photography and situated media that wasn't really grounded anywhere. And then I started studying cultural analysis, which similarly is not grounded anywhere. It's sort of more of like a method. And now I'm in environmental studies without a home department, and really searching for tethers. And so I kind of just always spend my time working between spaces. And I think I said the word incommensurable a few times in my talk. And that's something that I think I'm so interested in and always motivated by, like thinking about the ways that you can sort of inhabit the frictions between these differently produced knowledges that are sitting around the same thing. I think a lot about this sociological term, the boundary object, which is used to describe these concepts or objects that have different they travel through different kinds of disciplinary spaces and social worlds, but they maintain enough integrity that they can travel with a stability between them, but people kind of gather around them in different ways depending on how they are weathered by their spaces and their disciplines. And so, yeah, I guess I'm trying to sort of think about like the oyster right now in that kind of way.
I think I recently realized that like I was always interested in architecture school in like everything but the building, everything outside of it, from the like complex cultural condition in which a building was being built, or the we did a studio on the Arctic when I was in school, like all of the kind of complexity of an Arctic landscape. And so going into this thesis, I think it was clear, like I made a chimney, like it's like the smallest architectural element, but then like a vast narrative kind of around it. And so I think complexity in that way has always been interesting for me. And I think it similarly, it's sort of like that Donna Haraway's idea of like tentacular thinking, of like pulling in things from everywhere else to help navigate that kind of complexity that I've always, guess, been interested in. And so, yeah, I think I feel like architecture, like you get taught certain perspectives, but you can also just like go out there and find new lenses with which you can bring to the practice and say like, well, yes, I have this thing I've been conditioned to think, but I can also like multiply those perspectives and hopefully find totally new views of how I'm approaching a project.
That's a great answer. We have some more questions. So can you go back to the questions? Okay, stop. Okay, I enjoyed your interpretation of eco-utopian possibilities for suburbia. How do you stimulate big picture systems thinking and empathy with creatures like rats?
Can you say it again, the last part?
Yeah. So I enjoyed your interpretation of eco-utopian possibilities for suburbia. How do you stimulate big picture systems thinking and empathy with creatures like rats?
I will say, like, I did the thesis in part with like my tongue firmly in my cheek. I think like that was part of how I wanted to approach it, and to say like I want to be really serious, but I also want to imagine new kind of possibilities, and so you end up with like a raccoon aerating compost. So I feel like in order to start to approach a rat, you might have to do the same. Like there might be a certain amount of sort of playful imagination, but I think there's also right now our perception of rats is so tied to like cultural images of it in like New York City, for example, but there have been like long histories of people who actually have rats as pets, there's like a whole culture of like rat fancy where people would like breed particular qualities of rats. So I think it's like we also have to question like why do we see them in that way? And yes, of course, the Black Plague disease and what that is attached to, but I think it requires some disruption, and either with your tongue in your cheek or in a very serious manner to consider designing for new species like that.
Oh, we got one specifically for you, Megan. How do you keep hope when you see the growing ocean acidification and other measurable signs of climate change? And no pun intended, hope and hopes. But how do you keep hopes?
Thank you for that question. Hope is a tricky one. I feel like I was asked by one of my professors to give like a small lecture in her environmental humanities class last year on the concept of hope, and I really struggled with the prompt because I feel like I resist the language of hope. It can feel kind of just devastating to try and hold on to something that can feel a little bit like sometimes vacuous or sometimes hopeless. And there are just kind of like other effective orientations that I think maybe are more helpful for me. And a lot of that has come from reading theory and finding kind of communities of thinkers and activists and different kinds of practitioners. But for instance, I mentioned Kyle Powis White in my talk, and his paper, Our Ancestors' Dystopia Now, in which he describes apocalypse as a kind of reiterative process. So rather than orienting toward climate change as the end of the world for everyone in the same way, climate change is actually an end of a world that reiterates ends of worlds that have happened historically for the people who faced genocide and colonialism in this country, and others, including Australia, my home. And so kind of, removing like the power from it and the kind of like monolithic feeling that it can foster, I think has been a helpful starting point for me. And then, just like, I guess kind of, choosing to think with and stay with communities and people and creatures and ways of being that remember that we are still alive and we still need to care and love, and kind of beginning with that point of orientation and then working from there. So my PhD project, thanks to my wonderful advisor, I'm calling it How to Love an Oyster. And so I'm kind of like starting from this question of love and then moving from there, rather than a place of like hopelessness and despair.
That's really beautiful, and great answer to that question about hope. Now, Sarah, could you talk about how your work as a student has influenced your current work and practice now in teaching? And then for both Megan and Sarah, could you reflect on your past work-life experience and practice and how it impacted the way you're shaping your thesis? So your current thesis, Megan, and your past thesis.
So after I finished the thesis, I was encouraged by a professor to apply to the Bantam Fellowship. And in truth, sorry, Joyce, I didn't write about animals in architecture because I was applying to Buffalo. Joyce is, at Buffalo, and I was like, I shouldn't propose to keep doing this. And so I was actually like, as a pivot from that, I was like, okay, well, what if I take the exact same thing and think about older adults? And so I will say the tools and the methods that I sort of used to think in my master's thesis, the Umwelt drawings, the graphic standards, all of those just became tools that I carried with me into thinking about older adults and that lived experience. So method really was the thing that kind of carried through, and new ways of thinking.
I feel like the best way I can answer that question is talking again about how I sort of began my academic career in art. And then I found myself at a certain point kind of yearning for more rigor in the way I was thinking. And I loved writing, but I remember having the distinct feeling that I had nothing meaningful to write about. And so I kind of pursued graduate studies to kind of get there. And it's been really interesting to feel now this new kind of wave of yearning for material practice and creative togetherness. And I keep trying to kind of seek that out. Like I'm taking my first oil painting class right now. There's a painting on the wall just around the corner that you can go see. But I'm also trying to sort of begin creative collaborative projects that are sort of environmentally focused. I was organizing one with the space of the urban farm for the past year almost. And yeah, kind of feeling that kind of like artistic research and creative license maybe a little bit coming back into the work that I am trying to do, and letting it happen. At Adrienne Parr's talk last night, when she mentioned sort of finally being able to be herself, now I feel like maybe I'm just kidding myself and thinking that I have tenure somewhere because I'm like trying to do that now. And that's felt really great.
Really great. And speaking of the urban farm, for day 3 of the hosts conference tomorrow, we're having a design charrette on the urban farm designing bee hotels. So that's 1 to 3. Don't miss that. We have no more questions on the QR. If there's anyone in here who has a question, I can take some hands. Yes.
First, I just want to say to both of you, just really fabulous talks. Those are just amazing. So for Sarah, I just want to say that I love this idea, synanthropic prosthetics, and I would, love to have a compost chimney, a bird bath, even a habitat dormer. Like I would put them in right away if I could. I would love that. I already transformed almost all my lawn into native habitat for birds, bees, butterflies, snakes, other things. So I just totally love that. This is kind of a theoretical question for Megan. So I loved your the way that you had those questions written out for people, and one of them that I was really struck by was the set of questions of what subjectivity does objectivity demand, and of course from playing off at Daston and Gallison, which I use their work too, and then what world does that subjectivity require? And I think that's what you wrote there, if I can remember. I wasn't taking notes. But that the idea of subjectivity is as sort of requiring something and then being sedimented within these structural systems of oppression and dominance and all of that. Then when you were talking about, so I'm wondering about if aesthetics and embodiment, kind of both of them. Embodiment and aesthetics is a sort of a way, eluding subjectivity and the sort of mechanisms and systems in things like subjectivity. Does embodiment and aesthetics and the sensorium kind of, subtly move us out of those systems in a way? Can it be a mode of resistance, and is that part of artistic practice?
Very great question.
I feel like I'm going to adequately answer that question, maybe in like the second chapter that I give you to review in a few months' time. But right now, I think I will answer it maybe by talking about a class that I'm hoping to teach next year, which right now is called More Than Human Methodologies. It'll be an upper level undergraduate class in environmental studies. We get the opportunity to kind of create these experimental classes, which is pretty terrifying and exciting. And in that class, I'm trying to, I guess, lean into those questions specifically and get the students to start thinking about the production of knowledge not as something that is just given, but understanding the relationships and the power dynamics that are happening within and between disciplines, and noticing what they do take for granted and assume to be true in the production of knowledge. And so I guess I'm trying to kind of foreground multi-species relationships and play with when objectivity or subjectivity or something else are taken as the epistemic virtues that underground what's happening. And yeah, for me, always in environmental studies classes, I want to bring in art and creative practice as methods and as ways of kind of disrupting what is taken for granted in spaces that are just necessarily dominated by the natural sciences, regardless of whether you're in a humanities space or a social science space. It is always like the kind of what marks something as proper knowledge will always be kind of grounded in the natural sciences. And so I guess maybe I'm just going to say thank you for putting that pin in there, because I like the idea of asking them that question also.
And Sarah, do you have anything to say about? Okay. Nope, Sarah's not going to touch it. Well, thank you, Sarah and Megan, for your great presentations, great discussions. We're going to be taking an hour break before our keynote.